Thank you, Tim, and I would take my position as the only outsider, I think, in this forum. When I was reading the Prime Minister's essay the previous weekend in the Fairfax Press, it struck me that our country was talking itself into a very happy recession, but was preparing for a grumpy recovery. Relief at keeping one's job, I think, is mixed with the impending dread of having to earn a real living for a change without the easy credit and capital gains of the last boom. Now, those two lines are going to run in the paper tomorrow. That was the beginning of my preparation for this speech. But the interesting thing about that thought is that this government doesn't want to claim victory yet, and for good reason. It can't claim victory yet because the worst is still ahead. But I'm still fascinated by what's keeping Australia above zero, why it's still growing. Now, confidence does have something to do with it, but I think there's also a sense, and we have to take our minds back to the 2007 election. The Australian public punted a government at the top of an economic boom. It punted the government that had made them nominally very wealthy. It had punted a government because it thought the government had retreated from fields that were more important to them. It didn't want another check. It wanted a re-engagement of government at a number of levels. Now, I think when you come into a global financial crisis like the one we had last year, I think the Australian public were already of a mind that this thing was coming. In a funny way, it was coming to us. You notice how quickly the savings ratio, Treasurer, went up in that December quarter. It's almost as if collectively everyone said, right, the party is now well and truly over. I'm going to start looking after myself again. But the interesting thing is, where every other Western society went not into a collapse in consumer confidence, but then a very profound collapse in growth and a very rapid rise in unemployment, our little confidence drop was temporary, and then we got ourselves together again in the new year. Now, the government will claim that stimulus had a lot to do with it, but there is another thing in the national psyche that I think we will be investigating for a number of years to come in our capers, politics and in the media, because this is obviously an act of collective will. You know, an economy could have gone down the tube, just as every other economy did, because the public thought that the world had ended. We didn't think the world had ended. We looked around the world and thought something bad was happening, but then for some strange reason, we thought we were all right. Now, I'm quite fascinated by the display of social cohesion in the last couple of years. We're actually grumpier, I think, around 2004 or 2005 as a population, because we know that at years 14, 15 and 16 in our longest boom, there were riots. There were riots in Redfern, Macquarie Fields and in Cronulla. So there's obviously something not quite right then. We feel a bit calmer now. I wouldn't underestimate it. I wouldn't overestimate it, though, because when unemployment does tick over 7 and then 8, and if it does get to 8 or 9, you do get some very grumpy people coming into the public space, and politics does tend to get a bit more shrill. You only need to cast your minds back to the late 90s, well after the recession had ended, to remember what happened when Pauline Hanson turned up. A good 10 to 15% of the electorate said, "I hear you," and then it took politics a long time to recover from just that particular shock. Now, I take my mind back to the 2007 election and the decision to punt a government at the top of a boom, and then I look a year and a bit hence to the US election in 2008. They seem like two completely different events, but it's basically the same majority driving both those results. Now, Tim could probably tell you at detail how Labor scored big amongst young voters, amongst the under 35s. We were using crummy phrases like the youth belt to describe what was about to punt John Howard. Barack Obama pretty much drew the same majority for people under 35 that Labor had in 2007. Labor, we know, had spikes amongst all the minorities. We know that the overseas born certainly helped knock John Howard off in Bennelong. We know that single mums were doing their job, knocking off people like Mal Brough in Longman. Barack Obama, when you look at his majority, it is composed of young people and a whole lot of minorities. Now, these people now add up to 50+1 in a lot of our societies. Now, I wonder why Europe doesn't have its centre-left moment, and I think we're looking at monocultures there, and also perhaps the fact that they were in power for as long as they did, and they pretty much became captives of the language of power, things like monetary policy and fiscal policy, as opposed to what government is doing for you. Now, given that the majority here and in the US are similar, but obviously the experience in the US is different because they are having a very, very serious recession, it tells me that whatever the consensus is, for our soft landing and for their deep recession. It's basically the same opportunity for both governments. Now, one of the things that concerned me when I read the Prime Minister's speech yesterday was he almost reverted to the 2007 frame. I saw the word economic conservative in that speech. 1 minute he's trying to slay neoliberalism, the next minute he's owning up to economic conservatism. I don't think the stimulus was the end in itself. I don't think government stepped in just to prop up the economy. I think the global financial crisis gave this government the opportunity to bring forward some of its longer-term agenda. So having taken that decision and having used debt to fund a lot of what would otherwise have been funded out of the mining boom if nothing had gone wrong, the suggestion that the government withdraw in the next few years seems to me to be a false dichotomy. If the government is stepping in because the public wanted it to step in health and education and infrastructure, stay there. But if you're going to stay there, you're going to have to pay for it, not out of our pockets, because there's going to be enough calling in of favours of taxpayers in the next few years to get the budget back into surplus, but by thinking about what sort of government you need for the 21st century. I think there are probably entire departments, if they stop to think about what they do now, might be looking forward to redundancy in the next few years, to make way for an expanded role of government in some of the areas that we know Australia came up short after 17 long years of growth. We know basically the transaction that John Howard got wrong was that he put money in the hands of voters to consume privately what they'd previously expected the government to do for them. We know that the private health system, we know that private schools, and we know that the tollways at a state level were essentially these dummy transactions to put cash in the hand of somebody to prop up, to push cash in the hand of the consumer, to stop them buying the government product, to buy a private product that couldn't stand on its own 2 feet anyway. Now, if you're going to correct for that deficiency, you can't just step in whilst the cycle that permits it through debt and then walk away 2 or 3 years later. I think this is a much bigger conversation to have in the next few years, but I think it does involve a reinvention of government. Now, the final thought about the global crisis, sorry, I'm swinging back and forth from the domestic to the global, but I think we're about to go through a slightly different phase of globalisation to what we're used to. I don't think that the tariff wall is necessarily going to go up, but I think a lot of our societies are going to retreat on their own account, because to pay off some of the debts that have been needed to prop up financial systems overseas and to prop up spending in societies like ours that have got off relatively lightly, these deficits have no precedent in peacetime. They are essentially wartime borrowings. Now, to pay this stuff back, you're going to have to tap a unique source of funding in Australia, household savings. We haven't had much of that for the last 20 years. The Americans are going to need to learn to spend less and save more. The Chinese, and we've seen these lectures over the last few years, have been told that they need to spend more on their own economy and save less. Each society, for its own reasons, to correct this huge imbalance we see in the global financial system at the moment and in the world economy, is going to be withdrawing. So we're in a phase of retreat. That is the perfect opportunity to have the biggest debate I think you can have in the 21st century about what government does for a living. And I'll leave you with that thought.